Gabriel Kapchuk. I hope I pronounced it correctly. And it's about giving state to the stateless, augmenting trustworthy computation with ledgers. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. As mentioned, I'm Gabe Kapchuk. I'm a PhD student at Johns Hopkins. And this is joint work with my advisor, Matt Green, and my colleague, Ian Myers, who's now at Cornell Tech. This talk is entitled Giving State to the Stateless, Augmenting Trustworthy Computation with Ledgers. And before I really jump into it, I just wanted to quickly kind of put out a disclaimer that I think is kind of important. This is not super surprising given that you're in a blockchain session, but I feel important to put it out there anyhow. Blockchains is kind of the new fertile ground in our community and absorbs a lot of the research energy of our community. Unfortunately, in many ways, it's kind of haunted by the specter of cryptocurrencies. And so it's kind of hard to do research in things besides cryptocurrencies within the blockchain space. And so part of the reason we pursued this work was to try and see if it's really feasible to do work beyond cryptocurrencies that still incorporates ideas from blockchains as well as ledgers. The only thing that's kind of more controversial than blockchains in our community is, of course, studying SGX, and so we're going to talk about that as well. SGX, when it first came out, was basically heralded to be the end of all security research, because as soon as we could put all of our code inside of a trusted execution environment, there was no reason to do anything, right? We were all just done, and that, none of us were totally happy with that anyhow, but lo and behold, earlier this year, we all noticed that all of these things were very, 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 very broken, right? And so we're no longer quite as sure what the state of SGX is, but we at least know that there's plenty of good research left to do in this field. So why care about these two boogeymen? They were kind of the things that you might want to try and avoid when studying in our field. But in fact, these things kind of exist in practice, particularly ledgers. Deployments like Bitcoin and Ethereum are really stable, and they're out there, and they're there to stay. And so it's kind of incumbent upon us as researchers to find new and interesting ways to incorporate these technologies into our work. Additionally, trusted execution environments exist in practice. Well, kind of. They-ish exist. They might be a little bit broken, and I know a lot of people are probably going to get tenure by continually breaking these things, but we should still kind of study them anyhow. There's a couple of different deployments out there. Intel SGX, ARM Trust Zone. These are kind of hardware-backed solutions that have some trust that relies at a manufacturer level. There's also the possibility of software-only obfuscation, something like cryptographic obfuscation, which might not be practical today, but will likely be practical at some point in the future. And there's also these kind of IoT, FPGA-style deployments of a trusted enclave with a burned key where the security of the device is just, it's kind of hard and expensive to actually break into the thing. So once you have these two notions, and you want to kind of study them together, there's kind of the obvious question, what properties can we get from one to the other? And there's two different ways that you can go about studying this. There's how can you use trusted execution environments to augment a ledger and get new properties? But instead what we choose to do is look at trusted execution environments and see what additional properties we can get from combining them with a ledger. So in order to motivate this entire thing, we can think about a very simple pedagogical example, which is entering a password into a phone. Right? We all know that passwords are kind of broken. It's really hard to remember enough entropy in order to actually have a good password to protect from a brute force attack. And so what we've done with our phones, for instance, is we have these nice short passwords where you put in something like 1, 2, 3, 4. And the phone will tell you, no, that's not the right guess. But then there'll be a rate limiting step. Right? You can't just brute force all the guesses because the phone's going to stop you from guessing too many times. So what's actually happening on the back end here is there's some kind of trusted execution environment that holds a secret key of some variety. In this case, we can think of it as a key derivation function for the decryption key that will actually decrypt the entire device. Right? So when the user puts in 1, 2, 3, 4, the host device, in this case a phone, will take some encrypted state, doesn't know what's in it, and will hand it into the trusted execution environment, which contains the secret key, and say, hey, is the password 1, 2, 3, 4? The execution environment is actually going to evaluate the KDF over this guess and output a new encrypted state, right? And say, okay, next time you query me, give me this new encrypted state, and by the way, here's a key. It doesn't work. They have to try again, right? The obvious problem here is that there's a very trivial attack that involves rewinding state, right? So imagine that the hosts and the user want to get together to try and beat this trusted enclave. Well, there's no tight binding, right, behind the state and the guesses that are going in. So you might send in the state that says there's 10 guesses left, along with the password 1, 2, 3, 4. And then during the next iteration of the protocol, you can simply send the old state again. And the trusted execution environment has no way to know that you're replaying old state. So even though we have this trusted thing, we actually haven't bought ourselves any security. So there's a number of different deployed solutions to this particular problem. A lot of them rely on some kind of hardware solution. So whether it be NVRAM or monotonic counters, something within the hardware itself that we can write to. Unfortunately, these scale kind of poorly. They're ultimately quite expensive. And when you consider things in your threat modeling like a power fluctuation, they get very complicated very quickly. When you look at sort of software-only obfuscation, cryptographic obfuscation, you can't get any hardware-backed guarantees whatsoever, right? That's just going to be impossible because there is no hardware. You can always rewind these things. And so what we're going to set out to do is try to build a rewind protection mechanism that can work without these back-end hardware protections. Importantly, this problem is really, really hard, right? If we think back a couple of years when Apple and the FBI were yelling at each other quite publicly, our entire community kind of pointed to the obvious attack that could be launched on an iPhone where you could simply reflash the memory multiple times and get as many guesses as you want, right? So this is a very real problem that we need a solution to. So in order to motivate what these kind of rewind attacks look like, we'll kind of put a little bit more formalism on them. Imagine we have some initial state where there's 10 guesses left. At this point, the user can put in any number of passwords that will lead to a next sort of state, in which case it'll be 9 guesses left. So in this case, we might say that the user puts in 1, 2, 3, 5, and we transition to the next state. Right, at this point, similarly, there's going to be lots more opportunities for them to put in a password, and they can say 1, 2, 3, 4, and they transition to the next state. Right? And so what we're essentially building out here is a very large tree of states and inputs. And we're going to kind of refer to this as the execution tree. An important thing to note about this kind of structure is that re-executing a certain path that you've already done before on this execution tree doesn't introduce a vulnerability. Right? So you can go from 10 guesses left to 9 guesses left and simply put in 1, 2, 3, 5 over and over and over again, and that's totally fine. You'll just derive the same key over and over again, and you won't gain any additional information. What is a problem in these is forking, right? So you'll notice that if we go from 9 guesses left to 8 guesses left, in 2 different guesses, we will gain additional information. And so the idea of forking here is going to be kind of twofold. One is to execute on old state with new input. And a second example is executing an old transition, but with new randomness. And the high-level idea, what we're going to try and do is bind program execution, that is the execution through this tree, to something that is already linear. And as we're in a blockchain session, I'll give you a hint. It involves ledgers. So quickly, what our model is going to look like, we have an enclave, which is going to be co-located with a host. That is, it's going to be on some device. The enclave itself is trusted, but the host is not, right? It's your PC or your phone. And in our model, we consider both the host and the end user, the human being, to be colluding to try and attack the enclave. Lastly, we have the ledger. And the ledger we don't assume to be malicious. We kind of assume that it just wants to play with its blocks and not really do anything impactful, as it's a global ledger, right? It's not doing anything. It doesn't care about the attack it's launching on this particular enclave. And generally, we're speaking very generically about enclaves and ledgers. It's not particular to something like Bitcoin and Ethereum, but it could be kind of anything out there like Google transparency logs. In the enclave, similarly, we don't assume really anything. No NVRAM, no counters, no random number generation. The only thing that we need is a hard-coded long-term key that can remain secret. Right? And these things have to talk to each other. So quickly to define some interfaces, the host and the enclave talk to each other. The host sends in states and inputs. And the enclave is going to evaluate some function and give an output along with a new state. The ledger interacts with the host, well, exactly the way you think it does, because we're in a blockchain session, where you send data up to the ledger, and you get back some kind of publicly verifiable authenticator, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the user is going to be representing the human being at the end of it all, actually driving the inputs and outputs. There's a couple more assumptions we need to make in order to fully clarify what's going on here. We need some assumptions about the ledger. So we require our ledger to build a very familiar notion to anybody who studies this kind of thing, right? It's going to build a chain of values, and these things are going to be chained together using a cryptographic hash function. So this is very familiar to a transaction in Bitcoin or Ethereum. It doesn't particularly need to be those. It can be something more generic. The only thing that we require is when user data is appended to this ledger, it's bound up into a blob, and that blob is going to have the user data along with the previous transaction hash of the latest thing posted in this chain. And that entire thing is going to be bound up and given a unique identifier using the same cryptographic hash function. Another thing that we require is a publicly verifiable proof of publication and public access, right? Everybody who has network access should be able to get to this thing, and even if you don't have network access, you should be able to verify that something genuinely was included on the chain. Digital signatures will work perfectly well if you want some kind of computational security, Google CT log being a good example of that. Or proof of work is good enough if you want economic-based security. So in Bitcoin, it's infeasible to forge enough proof of works so that if you get enough proof of works in a row, you can be assured that it's actually genuinely from the Bitcoin blockchain. And lastly, just for the sake of this talk, we're going to assume that there's only a single user per ledger. In fact, we don't need this, and we don't really use it. It's just kind of to clean things up a little bit. So we're going to, just again, to motivate exactly what we're going to do here, we're going to get this linearity from the ledger, right? And so these hash chains are going to be linear, and you're not going to be able to fork them. And what we want to do is bind them very tightly to the state that's being executed and the transitions that are being executed through this execution tree. And the idea here is that if you were able to fork on the execution tree, that should correspond exactly to forking on the ledger. And we already know that forking on the ledger is not going to be possible, and therefore it should be infeasible to actually fork on the execution path, right? And this is where our security is going to come from. So we're going to run through one quick round of how this works, not including all of the bad things that can happen, just so we get an idea of what's going on. So the user is going to drive this iteration of the protocol by putting in its guess, 1, 2, 3, 4. And the state, notice, the host has this encrypted state, 10 guesses left. Right, so the host wants to run on this state and on this input, and so what it's going to do is generate a commitment to the state along with the input 1, 2, 3, 4 under some randomness R, and it's going to send this commitment C up to the ledger, and the ledger is going to do what the ledger always does. Whenever it gets a new piece of information, it's just going to append it and include this previous transaction hash and then hash the entire thing. It's going to return this blob along with the authenticator back to the host. And the host is then going to bind all these, put all these things together and send them into the enclave. In particular, it's going to send in the state, meaning 10 guesses left, the input, 1, 2, 3, 4, this commitment that was posted onto the blockchain, along with the opening to that commitment, the blob, and this authentication tag. So at this point, most of the logic of the system comes into play inside of the enclave itself. We need to make sure, we can do a little bit of bookkeeping here to make sure that nothing bad has happened in the outside world, because the enclave has no idea what's happened in the enclave world. In order to do that, it'll sort of verify that the host provided information that supposedly is from the blockchain or from the ledger is genuine, using this publicly verifiable functionality, this signature. And similarly, it'll make sure that the thing that was actually posted, this commitment, corresponds to the input state along with the guess or the input that's being made in this round. Right? And now comes the part where we want to sort of bind the state to the linearity of the ledger. And the way we're going to do that is notice that each of these blobs up on the ledger have a transaction hash along with a previous transaction hash. And what we're going to do is derive keys for an authenticated encryption scheme from these hashes, right? And we know that all of these hashes are going to be unique because we know they can't fork, right? So there's only going to be one blob in the entire chain that has a particular value as its previous transaction hash, and only one that has it as the transaction hash itself. So what we do here, right, we feed the previous transaction hash, right? 10 is the incoming state. So we're going to take the previous transaction hash, run it through a pseudo-random function keyed by this long-term key hidden by the enclave in order to generate the unique decryption key. We're going to decrypt the state and get out, okay, there's 10 guesses left. That looks valid. We can actually run. You're not out of guesses. And then the enclave is going to actually evaluate the functionality itself. Notice here that we also said in the very beginning that if you're able to run with different random coins, that could cause a fork. So we actually derive our coins deterministically using the same pseudo-random function. This is kind of a known technique for single-step programs. In the multi-step program setting, it's a little bit more complicated. At this point, we're going to evaluate the functionality within the enclave that we originally set up to do. So in this case, it's going to be this KDF function, and it's going to output a key, along with a new state, 9 guesses left. At this point, we can use the current transaction hash, right? And in the next iteration, this will be the previous transaction hash, so this will work, to generate a new encryption key, which is unique, and encrypt the state, right? At this point, the encrypted state, along with the output of the function, which seemed to have disappeared in my slide, can be handed out to the host. Right? Back on the host side, we'll receive this output of the functionality along with the new state. And it can update its state so there's 9 guesses left in its current state, and can try to run this key, try and decrypt itself using this key. It will fail, and will output decryption failure, 9 guesses left, right? So this is what one iteration of our protocol looks like. It's a little bit complicated, so if you would like to talk about it a little bit more and with a little bit more detail, I'm happy to do so offline. So what have we actually managed to do here? What we've managed to do is condition execution of a program on posting something publicly to the ledger, right? And the nice property that we've gotten so far out of this is that because ledgers have this nice linearity property, we're actually protecting ourselves against rewind attacks just for free. But there's also a couple of other important things that we're able to do at the same time. So the first extension is that we can actually require programs to publish something publicly. So before we've been posting a commitment where you can't actually see anything in the outside world, but what if we want something like logging, right? We want to make sure that a program always posts a specific log message to the ledger before executing its next step. We're actually able to condition execution on that posting. We're also able to achieve one-time programs. I've kind of swept some things under the rugs that make that a little bit more complicated, but we're able to achieve real one-time functionality by combining ledgers and trusted execution. So the couple additional applications I'm going to go through very quickly. We just had a nice primer on smart contracts. You're actually able to get private data execution in smart contracts using this very easily. The idea being that you have lots of execution environments, trusted execution environments with a shared key, and they can each update the ledger and then pull down the new state between them, decrypt it, and then run the next iteration of the execution. The final application that I just want to talk about briefly is that this also raises some malicious applications. If you have a trusted execution environment that is no longer really trusted but has been owned in some way, you're actually able to deploy autonomous ransomware. One of the good things about ransomware, if there are any good things about ransomware, is that human beings have to be there at the end of the day to send your decryption key back to the attacked user. If you have a trusted execution environment which is owned, you can actually make it force somebody to give it a proof that it has made a payment on the blockchain, and that'll be sufficient to release the key. So you wouldn't actually need any human beings at the end of the day. Finally, just some conclusions, we create a novel protocol that provides some trustworthy state properties for trusted execution environments by binding state to an append-only ledger. And that ledgers are here to stay, and we should do more than just cryptocurrency research with them. Particularly, state is a really difficult problem with wide-ranging applications, and we probably should be kind of thinking about ways of addressing that more, and doing more than just cryptocurrency research. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Oh, there's already a question.
Sorry. Bingshen from Lancaster University. So in your setting, the host OS is malicious, right? Okay, and the hardware is honest, and the hardware do not have its own state. You can rewind it. How can you ensure the host always gives the latest blockchain to the hardware? Why the host will not cut off and give the old one again and again?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, I had to kind of cut out some of the intuition given the shortness of the talks. The idea here is that if you think back to the execution tree, you can run those old states as many times as you want without actually getting any new information. And so what you do is if you kind of you format your program in a particular way, you can execute old blockchain state as many times as you want, and you'll just get the same decryption key in the case of the password guessing game multiple times. In fact, in order to really fork on the blockchain, you have to add something new to the end, right? Because it has to have the latest blob has to have the correct previous transaction. It's a little bit complicated. We can go over it offline.
But so sorry. So my intuition is the host can actually simulate the entire blockchain because it's a hardware and it shouldn't know it's a real chain or it's a fake chain. I can create a chain at my home and tell you this is a blockchain. How can you make sure the hardware knows it?
Yeah, so there's, depending on what kind of security you want, there's a couple of different things you can rely on. So first of all, if you hard code the difficulty into the trusted enclave, you can't actually just build an entire chain on your own. That would be considered economically infeasible. If that's not enough for you, then you can hard code the public key of the ledger into the enclave, right? And then you'd have to forge a digital signature. So while you're right that if you kind of only think about the economic security setting, there could be a forking attack, but just as we consider that sufficient to give us security in the Bitcoin setting, we consider that sort of, if you want economic security, sufficient in this setting.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm audio Postolaki from Mediated Zurich.
Can you please
Sorry, can we
speak up?
turn up the mic?
Oh, sorry. So thank you for your talk, Maria Postolaki from Mediated Zurich. I wanted to ask, the ledger that you're talking about, is it like, should you have internet connection to access it, or how are you going to access and exchange this?
Sorry, can you repeat the question one time? I couldn't quite hear.
I'm asking whether in order to do a commit, you actually need to be online.
You actually have to hit the chain itself?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the host is going to have to post something to the genuine ledger, each iteration through the protocol, yeah.
So is the delay that this would require not something sufficient, like important that you...
Yeah, so at this point we're just we're focusing on feasibility. And so obviously if you're going to use, for instance, the Bitcoin network, this is going to be incredibly slow. You're going to have to wait an hour for each step through the execution tree. But there are much faster things coming out. For instance, like Algorand is very fast whenever it gets deployed. It should be very fast. And so while we're not in the moment, we wouldn't want to really deploy this. But in the future, this might actually be very feasible.
Thank you.
So is there any other question? If not, I would like to ask two questions. I mean, one question and one comment. The first question is I did a chance to compare counter. If you have counters, because trusted execution environments, you can use counter, and this rewind problem is a known problem. Did you compare it to what is the cost for having a state with counters, for example, and compared to the ledger? Because as she was asking you, you must be online, you need a delay, and it's not clear if at the end you get the resulting, let's say.
Yeah, sure. I think really importantly, if you consider in the sort of modern trusted execution, hardware-backed trusted execution environment, this idea of monotonic counters is something that you certainly could use, and that there is a lot of previous work. For instance, Memoir does a really good job kind of efficiently using monotonic counters to this end. I think there's two important examples where that's not necessarily sufficient. One, if you ever try to consider software-only execution environments like cryptographic obfuscation, you don't have monotonic counters, and there's no way that you ever will.
It's a software solution, yeah.
Right. So if it's a software-only obfuscation, like cryptographic obfuscation. A second example is that in sort of the cloud setting, even right now, it's not immediately obvious that monotonic counters are going to be super efficient or very available. Right? There's been a lot of trouble actually rolling these out onto cloud platforms where this would be very easy to set up. In terms of genuine cost trade-offs, I think this kind of apples and oranges, right? We really are trying to show feasibility of this protocol and to get new properties. And it might be faster to run with monotonic counters, but there are settings in which that's simply not feasible.
Okay, and my comment is, I think on one of the slides you mentioned using the system with Ekiden. I think it was written Ekiden, and what is the use of Ekiden there?
Ekiden is a sort of follow-up work to ours, which does a lot of the similar things, and there's a lot of overlap. So we wanted to make sure that we pointed to them. Okay,
but I would point you to a new upcoming work, which is called FastKiden. It's accepted as Usenix. It's on the ePrint. You should look at it.
Great.
It's a better version of Ekiden. Okay.
Sounds great.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with this, the session is over, and he is available. All the speakers are available for your fantastic questions.
So I'll give it